Hey guys, so for this week, I took a look at an article by B.B. Reynolds et al. It was published in 2017 in the Journal of Neurotrauma, and it's called A Comparative Analysis of Head Impact and Contact and Collision Sports. So as a brief overview, the researchers looked at the rates of head collisions in 4 different sports, and they compared their severity and frequency. So those 4 sports that they looked at were college football, high school football, college soccer, and college lacrosse. And the way that they measured the head collisions were through head impact sensors. They wore them over the mastoid process behind the ear, and they wore these for every single game and team training. The demographics was 61 total athletes across the 4 sports. There's about 12 to 16 per sport. They were all male, unfortunately. I think this is due to them having to include football in the sports. Obviously, there's really no comparison for women's football in most university settings. There was also minimum playing time requirements that had to be met for the participant to be included in the study. So the goal of the study was to assess the head impact severity and the head accelerations that resulted from the head impacts. They evaluated the impacts per event, which was per game and per practice, and they measured peak linear acceleration and peak rotational acceleration on each impact. And then they averaged it out at the end to get a final score. They wanted to measure the differences in frequency and to measure how often these impacts are happening across each sport. And the repetitive subconcussive blows are important to consider because even though they're not true concussions, they add up over time and they can cause degenerative effects over time. The study was really cool because it's a actual quantification of subconcussive forces, where usually we don't get an actual representation of what the forces are objectively. This one was able to provide numerical values to each force, and they aggregated it over time to get a final score. So statistical analysis was done using SAS version 9.4, and they used a generalized estimated question for comparing the number of impacts per practice among different sports. So they had to use a special equation to be able to compare the head impact rates and frequencies because of the difference in each sport. And what they found was that college football, unsurprisingly, had the most impacts per practice and the second most per game. What was important, I think, was that they had the highest average linear and rotational impact severities. I think we would all assume this, but it was interesting to see actually objectively. They found that college soccer had the second most impacts per practice, and they actually had the most per game. On the flip side, though, they had the lowest average linear and rotational impact severity, so they're actually the least damaging. High school football had the third most impacts per game, and their impact severity was actually on par with college football, which is, believable if we compare the 2 sports. College lacrosse had the fewest impacts per event, which I think is unsurprising considering the nature of the sport. But the head impacts were the third lowest average in severity. So bottom line, what does this mean? It means that football at the high school and college levels, they pose the most risk for neurodegeneration through these subconcussive impacts. This has been known for quite some time, and the nature of the sport, this kind of makes sense. There's a lot of head impacts overall. And this study really found out that those impacts were the most damaging and they had the highest severity. Soccer also poses a similar risk and frequency of impacts, but not the severity. So even though there was a lot of head impacts, the actual damage and the intensity of those impacts was pretty low. And of course, what they found obviously is lacrosse posed the least amount of threat. There's probably the least amount of ball contacts and least amount of head-to-headed. Some critiques of the study. The 4 sports that they selected were good, but they could have included I think more. They could have probably included basketball as well. And of course, like I said earlier, the demographic and gender was a little bit not diverse. Like they should have included women's sports as well to account for, our entire sporting population. And of course, there are some time constraints. They did this over one season, but I would like to see what would happen if it was done over a few seasons or over 5 years. Thank you.